In the coming weeks, the United States could freeze the most important military deal in Australian history. AUKUS, the submarine pact meant to anchor Australia's defence for a generation, is now under formal review by the Pentagon. And the timing is no accident. In early June, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called on Australia to raise its military spending to 3.5% of GDP, nearly double current levels, and to do so immediately, citing near-term threats in the Indo-Pacific. Since then, the pressure has only grown. With many NATO allies now committing to Trump's more aggressive defense targets, US officials are openly questioning whether Australia is pulling its weight. And they're now asking what Canberra won't say out loud. Is Australia truly ready for a regional conflict? Not in the 2030s, but this decade. And if the answer is no, the consequences could extend well beyond AUKUS. Because even if the submarine deal survives, the message from Washington couldn't be clearer. Distant promises for Australia's defence are no longer enough. Australia needs to show it's ready and willing to carry real military weight in a region growing more volatile by the year. So the question now isn't just about submarines. It's about whether Australia can survive the next crisis in its own backyard. This is because Canberra's not just facing diplomatic pressure from Washington, it's facing real strategic pressure much closer to home. In recent months, China has been probing Australia's defences like never before. People's Liberation Army Navy warships have now circumnavigated Australia for the first time, staging live fire drills in the Tasman Sea, likely with a nuclear-powered submarine in tow. As the flotilla passed through the Torres Strait, the narrow channel that separates northern Australia from Papua New Guinea, a Chinese drone breached PNG's airspace, flying at least 6 kilometers inland to survey terrain just off Australia's northern doorstep. Then came the research vessels, skimming the edge of Australia's southern waters, quietly charting undersea cables critical to Canberra's communications and command systems. These aren't isolated incidents. China is testing the boundary of Australia's awareness, and so far, that boundary looks worryingly soft. And it's all being accompanied by a massive campaign of cyber attacks. In 2024, the Australian government, for the first time, publicly criticized China for repeatedly attacking government and private networks, in a sign of just how serious the problem has become. Meanwhile, Australia's geography, once its best defense, no longer buys the protection it once did. Long-range missiles, cyber attacks, naval incursions, all of it lies now more or less within the reach of the Chinese military. And then there's Darwin. Back in 2015, the Northern Territory government leased the port of Darwin to a Chinese company for 99 years. It was a commercial deal, but it looked deeply naive to Australia's allies. Now, with Chinese warships cruising Australia's coastline, the Darwin lease is back in the headlines, and back on the agenda in US defense circles. Because Washington wants allies who are not just armed, but resilient, commercially, politically, and strategically. And from ports to military procurement, from cyber readiness to munitions stockpiles, there's a growing perception that Australia still hasn't sealed the cracks in its national defenses. Every time China pushes a little harder, the US expectation for Australia rises. And the longer Australia delays upgrades to its defenses, the more exposed it looks in the eyes of the Pentagon. As a result, the US is now demanding Australia do more. The first warning shot from the Pentagon came earlier this month. Trump's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth didn't mince words. He told his Australian counterpart to raise defense spending by an extra 40 billion Australian dollars a year as soon as possible. But Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese brushed it off, saying the government would decide what happens with the defense budget. Yet Washington's patience is wearing thin, and this is probably where the AUKUS review fits in, a tool of US pressure to get Australia to do more. Because, from the American perspective, Australia is falling behind, not just in dollars, but in urgency. While democracies around the world have surged their defense budgets in response to growing geopolitical instability, Australia has stuck to its long-term glide path, a slow climb towards 2.4% of GDP by the mid-2030s. But the region may not wait that long. China is pursuing the largest peacetime military build-up since World War II, and right now, Australia is not ready. At the same time, however, Canberra is also reckoning with a fundamental rupture in US policymaking, the likes of which the world has not experienced in more than half a century. Some Australian decision-makers and security experts are now questioning the country's relationship with the US and asking whether it's in the national interest to continue pursuing defense and security alignment with what they consider to be an unpredictable partner. These and other questions now dominate discussions among Australia's security establishment. But even as this plays out, one truth remains constant. Australia's military is not ready for a more uncertain geopolitical environment. Indeed, Australia's defense strategy is increasingly at odds with the pace of emerging threats. While the government has articulated a vision for a robust, technologically advanced force by the mid-2030s, current investments fall short of addressing immediate security challenges. The Australian Defence Force is not only under-equipped, but also structurally misaligned with the demands of contemporary warfare. The force is caught in a transitional phase, unprepared for present conflicts, and not accelerating quickly enough to deter future aggression. The timelines for major acquisitions, especially the nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS partnership and future surface combatants, extend well into the next decade and beyond. While these long-term capabilities are critical for deterrence, they offer little immediate enhancement. Yet, they are consuming a growing share of the defense budget, diverting funds and focus away from sustaining and strengthening today's force. The result is what critics call a paper ADF that lacks near-term readiness and is vulnerable to conflict scenarios that could emerge this decade. For example, the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Program, aimed at creating domestic missile production, won't yield even limited quantities of short-range missiles until late 2025. A fully operational, sovereign manufacturing capability remains at least a decade away. In the interim, Australia is relying on limited off-the-shelf purchases of longer-range systems. Naval capabilities are also constrained. The fleet comprises 3 Hobart-class destroyers and 7 aging Anzac-class frigates. While plans are underway to replace the Anzacs with 11 new general-purpose frigates, the selection process for these vessels is still pending, with construction unlikely to commence before 2026. Meanwhile, the first of the 6 advanced Hunter-class frigates is not expected to enter service until around 2032, with subsequent ships following in the mid-2030s. Air power investments represent one bright spot for Australia. The country now boasts a fleet of 72 F-35As, packing a formidable offensive punch. The Air Force is also maintaining its fleet of Super Hornets and Growlers, although there's an absence of funding for next-generation capabilities. In particular, the MQ-28 Ghost Bat drone, a promising indigenous project, lacks clear integration plans and sustained investment. Notably, the air domain's share of the defense budget has decreased from 18.6% to 13% in the latest financial year. Personnel shortages compound these issues. Despite efforts to reverse a 3-year decline, the ADF remains approximately 4,300 personnel below its authorized strength. Recruitment challenges are particularly acute in the Army, which has seen an 8.6% workforce reduction over 4 years. Retention is equally problematic, with about 10% of the force resigning annually. This confluence of delayed capability development, underfunded current forces, and personnel shortfalls paints a picture of a defense apparatus unprepared for near-term contingencies. Even Defense Minister Richard Marles, long cautious in his public language, has now broken cover. Speaking at the Defending Australia Summit, Marles called China's military expansion the greatest risk to regional stability, and admitted that Australia's continental geography would become a liability in the event of a US-China conflict. It's a big thing to say, he acknowledged, but it's true. For the first time in decades, an Australian government is openly naming the threat, but the recognition alone doesn't close the gap between strategy and reality, and that gap is what worries Washington the most. The disparity between strategic rhetoric and actual preparedness suggests a partner that may not be ready to respond effectively to emerging threats in the Indo-Pacific. Without a recalibration towards immediate capability enhancement, Australia risks being perceived not just as underprepared, but as a potential liability in collective defense arrangements. AUKUS was meant to be the centrepiece of Australia's defense future, a once-in-a-generation partnership linking Canberra, Washington, and London through shared military technology and nuclear-powered submarines. But now it's under formal review by the US Department of Defense. At the center of that review is Elbridge Colby, a senior Trump official who has made no secret of his skepticism. He's not opposed to the idea of AUKUS, but he doesn't think it works in practice. In his view, transferring submarines in the early 2030s does nothing to solve a crisis that could arrive in the second half of this decade. And if US industrial capacity is already stretched, as many inside the Pentagon admit, Colby wants to know why America should give away any of its submarines at all. That's not just a production question, it's a trust question. Because in Washington, there's a growing feeling that Australia wants the benefits of alliance without fully paying the price. The review may be strategic, or it may be tactical, a hardball move to push Canberra into committing more money more urgently. Either way, the message is clear. Alliances are conditional. If Australia doesn't deliver on its end, the US might not either. And in a region where timelines are collapsing, that is a risk Australia can't afford to carry.